Hi, everyone. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by another podcast I've been listening to the last couple of weeks. It's called Everything, Everywhere, Daily. This is Gary Arnett's beautiful podcast. It's just amazing. He just cranks these things out every single day. I mean, it's called Everything, Everywhere, Daily, and he means daily. So if you scroll down through, you just get this incredible variety of topics. For example, here's one called The East African Rift. The rift isn't cultural, political, or economic, it's geological. And this is what revealed all the ancient hominid findings over the last century or so that pushed back the origins of humanity, millions of years. The Fermi paradox. Where's everybody? If extraterrestrial life, the origins of life, is so common chemically throughout the universe, and every star has a planet or multiple planets, there's bound to be some that are in the habitable zone and some that evolved species. They should have been here by now. Where is everybody? This is one of the most important subjects, I think, interesting. Here's one: uncontacted peoples. Uncontacted peoples. Yeah, there's still people out there that have not encountered modernity. The lost colony of Roanoke. Why is the sky blue? Ah, yes. That one I'm going to listen to because my little 7-year-old is going to ask me that someday, and I'm going to have the answer to it. Anyway, that's the idea. Gary posts these everything, everywhere, daily, literally, and it's just like 10, 15 minutes long. Each one of them is short, just enough so like if you're running errands or you're just doing a quick workout, whatever, you can consume a couple of these. I often do 2 or 3 at a stretch. And it's a great way to, I think, give your brain some variety in addition to listening long-form lectures and books. These little short tutorials here are just fabulous. So check it out. Everything, Everywhere, Daily. You can get it at Spotify or any of the regular podcast platforms. All right. Speaking of podcasts, here's my episode. If you want to support the podcast, go to skeptic.com/donate, because the podcast is primarily supported by the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. We've been in business for over 30 years, and if you support our promotion of science, critical thinking, rationality, and logic, which the world could use these days, steeped in fake news and alternative facts, and the 2024 election coming up, we're all over it. Give us some love there. All right. Oh, and by the way, forgot to always promote the latest issue of Skeptic on energy matters. Look at our 1950s cover. Check that out, Nancy. Is that cool?
That's
or what?
fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah. So how can we get to that future? Well, we discussed some issues with that. Okay, my guest today is Nancy Segal, our returning champion. Nancy, I think this is your 3rd time on the show.
At least.
She's a psychology professor and director and founder of the Twin Studies Center at California State University, Fullerton. She's authored over 300 scholarly articles and 8 books. Her 2012 book, Born Together, Reared Apart, the landmark Minnesota Twin Study, won the American Psychological Association's William James Book Award. Her recent work, Deliberately Divided, Inside the Controversial Study of Twins and Triplets Adopted Apart, was the focus of a July 2022 BBC documentary. It was a great documentary. It's unbelievable. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Atlantic Monthly. She's appeared on national and international television programs, including Oprah Winfrey, Good Morning America, The Today Show, and the BBC. She's also the author of The Twin Children of the Holocaust. Here it is, Stolen Childhood and the Will to Survive. Besides the Minnesota Twin Study, the Holocaust has to be the most famous example of twins. It's a beautiful book. It's filled with 4-color photos, printed on high glossy paper. It's really nice. And her new book is called Gay Fathers, Twin Sons, the Citizenship Case that captured the world. There it is. All right. It came out this week. We're recording this on August 9th. Came out yesterday. Nancy Segal, I can't believe you got another book. It's amazing how you crank these things out. And you know what you remind me of? You're like Forrest Gump. You're always at the right place at the right time to get the craziest things that happen to you and stories that happen, all related to your subject. It's remarkable.
Well, Michael, there are so many interesting stories involving twins, and each one is a unique take on human development. Everyone has a message. Everyone has something to say. And I hear a lot of these stories, but there are some that are just so compelling. For example, the doubly switched Colombian twins. I ran right down to Bogota twice when I heard about them. And the Holocaust twins goes back to a 1985 meeting I went to at Yad Vashem and Auschwitz when these twins were having their anniversary reunion, the 40th, of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet troops. And then this most recent one that came out just yesterday, Gay Fathers, Twin Sons. When I saw that article in the LA Times in 2018, I knew it was mine. And the difficult part of that book was that there was a lawsuit pending. And so I couldn't speak to family, I couldn't speak to friends, although I admit I snuck a quick phone call into the sister of one of the partners. But I had to wait until that case settled, until I get close to it. But it's a book that combines twinship and family and gay marriage and immigration and citizenship and egg donation and surrogacy. I mean, it's got so many timely themes, and the family is wonderful, just wonderful. So it was great. And you mentioned that I've done 8 books. Well, I've done 9 as of yesterday, just to correct the record.
Okay, number 9. Yes, but we've talked off the record about your writing a memoir. I think you should do this because of all the stories you have of just what it's like to meet these people, or the reunion with twins that have never met each other. I mean, it's just the coincidences that happen. It's just amazing how these things come together.
Yeah, well, a memoir is something I think about, and I've been keeping a notebook on different recollections as they come to me. And someday I would like to put that out. I'm developing another book proposal right now, and we'll see if I can put some of that in there. So we'll see. A memoir is certainly not out of question.
So the Gay Father's Twin Sons. So I think we need to kind of bring everybody up to speed on what are twins? What are the different kinds of twins and options? It's not as simple as most people think it is.
No. There were basically 2 types of twins: the identical, or what we call monozygotic twins, that result when a single fertilized egg divides sometime between the 1st and 14th conceptional day. And these twins share all their genes, roughly speaking, 2 males, 2 females. Now, the other twins are the fraternal, or what we call dizygotic, because they result from 2 separate eggs released at the same time by the same woman, and they're separately fertilized by 2 separate sperm from the father. But within each type, there are some fascinating variations. And one of those fraternal twin variations is relevant to the theme of gay fathers, twin sons, namely a process called superfecundation. Now, what is that? It's long term, but what it means is that these twins were conceived by different fathers. And so, obviously, in the case of a gay couple, this was done through in vitro fertilization. They had an egg donor. The eggs were fertilized in the laboratory. It turned out that the top quality embryos, one man contributed sperm to one egg and the other one contributed the sperm to the other. So the twins were really genetic half siblings, not full siblings. They shared 25% of their genes on average. But you can have that process naturally if a woman releases 2 eggs at the same time, has sexual relationships with 2 different men. Those eggs could get separately fertilized by different individuals.
Whoa. right there, it starts to get complicated. So the case of the gay guys, the egg donors were it was one woman or 2 different women?
It was one egg donor, which is why they share genes on the maternal side.
I see.
And then this egg donor contributed 40 eggs, actually. That's a lot.
Whoa.
Good amount. And the men didn't care who the father was. It just turned out that the top quality embryos were one of mine and one of yours. And they were implanted into the womb of a surrogate who bore the pregnancy for 7 months and delivered 2 beautiful twin boys, Aiden and Ethan.
Right. Okay. And then walk us through a little bit of the logistics of this medically and legally. I mean, there must be contracts and lawyers and all this stuff to keep track of all this.
Absolutely. They were living in Canada. Just a little backstory on the life histories of the 2 men.
Yeah.
Andrew is from the United States, also has Canadian citizenship because his parents were originally from Canada. And when he was about 25 or so, he went to Tel Aviv University to get a master's degree in international relations. And there he met Elad, who was also a student at Tel Aviv University. They fell in love and they decided to live in Canada and get married there because in 2010, 2011, you could marry in Canada. You could not marry in Israel, and you still can't. But you can marry in the US, but not until 2015. So then in about 2016, they decided to have a family, and that's when they began to explore surrogacy and egg donation and those sorts of things. Now, the trouble began when they attempted to leave Canada when the twins were 4 months old. And they went into the U.S. consulate in Toronto, and the officer there just threw a barrage of intimate and rude questions. Where are these children from? Where'd you get them? Who's the father? Is anyone the father? I mean, just horrendous questions you would never ask a heterosexual couple. And the men both knew. They knew that Andrew was the father of Aiden and Eli was the father of Ethan, but these were intimate details that no one knew at that time except the two fathers, the surrogate, and their physician. At this point, the officer would not accept the DNA report because they use a specific laboratory, so the men had to spend another $1,000 to repeat that test. And the upshot was, after several months, that little Aiden, who had a U.S. father, was given a U.S. passport. Ethan was given a tourist visa because he had an Israeli father. And there was no U.S. biological connection, which was a complete misinterpretation of the law even at that time. And so the family came to the U.S. and they were in constant fear that their child might be stolen from them. It was a slim chance, but it was a realistic fear. You know, these were little boys. They had a nanny to take care of them because both men had to work. They worried that the nanny was not a native English speaker. They used to keep their telephones right by their workplace in case an emergency call came through. Eventually, another thing I should add, at the time, they needed to get an immigration lawyer, but this is the year when Trump banned entry to the United States for Muslims of 7 different nations. So all the immigration lawyers were at LAX airport in Los Angeles. They talked to a couple of crackpot attorneys that they couldn't stand. And finally, a colleague of Elad's put them in touch with Immigration Equality, a wonderful organization in New York City that works pro bono with law firms on behalf of transnational couples, gay couples, HIV-infected couples who have these citizenship and immigration hassles. And they're very selective about the cases they take. They had 2 or 3 others pending. And when they heard about Andrew and Elad's case, of course, it was a natural because twins were involved. And boy, did that make an impact on the general public who saw it. No question that the case went viral. I got involved way in the beginning when I heard about it in this level. I contacted one of the lawyers and said, look, the law firm was in Los Angeles. I said, you've got a resident twin expert in the suburbs. I could testify on behalf of keeping those twins together because there was not as much focused on the twinship angle as much as the parents and the children. And I felt that that was an important aspect of this case that really strengthened it. But anyway, the case never really went to trial, so they didn't need me. But still, I felt like I should have been used at some level. Anyway, the case almost went to the Supreme Court. It was filed by the family against the U.S. State Department and first Secretary of State Tillerson, and then replaced by Mike Pompeo. There were some decisions in favor of the family by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that were then appealed by the government on the last day. That happened once or twice. So the case didn't finally settle until October of 2020, and they didn't get a final clearance that their lives were their own until sometime in June of 2021. So what they did was brave, it was strong, it was a difficult way to get citizenship for their little boy, but it was ultimately the best way. And it sets a wonderful precedent for other transnational families who have children outside the U.S. who are having struggles bringing their children into the U.S. And it actually caused a revision in the Foreign Affairs Manual, which is the guidance used by consular officers.
I can just picture this paper-pushing bureaucrat at the immigration going, okay, let me get this straight. What? Who's the mother again? And which one are you? Yeah. I remember when Jennifer, my wife from Cologne, Germany, came here, and we ended up kind of navigating the immigration system. I ended up hiring an attorney just because I gave up. It was so complicated. And they sort of walked us through it. And they gave us the practice questions. And indeed, they actually asked some of these, the lamest questions, like, have you ever been a member of a terrorist organization? You know, what's you going to go? Wait a minute, let me think. Maybe. I mean, Who would say yes or even hesitate, right? But they also want to know if she was ever a Nazi, or joined a neo-Nazi group, or are you coming here to practice prostitution? I'm sitting there, but we're getting married. What do you mean you come here to practice prostitution?
Well,
yeah, I'm a pimp.
yeah.
But they just
I'll
ask
tell
these
you, Michael,
questions.
the situation was even worse than I described because, first of all, it was January when they went to the Toronto consulate. It was freezing cold outside. They had to wait for 30 minutes with their little twin boys who were 4 months old. They finally got in and got a number and had to wait for a while. Their papers were filed, and the officer said, yes, the file's complete because they brought birth certificates. They were legally recognized. Both parents were recognized legally as the parents of both twins by the Canadian government, and they had their marriage certificate. I mean, they had everything in order. But after things began to get kind of testy, when the officer was throwing these questions at them, everyone's voice is escalating, and the people nearby that window were starting to overhear the conversation. And as Andrew and Elad said, they were running out of diapers. I mean, they had that to consider as well. So they went back home that day just forlorn, just not knowing where to turn. And they really didn't have anything to do in terms of helping themselves until they hit immigration equality. And I can't say enough wonderful things about that group and the kinds of work that they do.
Right. So let's talk about IVF and all that. You mentioned 40 eggs. I mean, Jennifer and I did this for our son. We did IVF, and that was quite the ordeal to get the eggs. I mean, I just couldn't believe it compared to what the guys have to contribute, which is, the kind of thing we do anyway. It's right. So,
and you produce millions, and you produce in one ejaculate enough to impregnate every woman on the planet.
I know it's astonishing. So, but aren't there some ethical issues and people complaining about women doing this because it may affect poor women more than rich women, or I don't know, something like this?
I'll tell you something very interesting about Canada. They have what's called altruistic surrogacy. And what that means is that the surrogates there and the egg donors only get expenses reimbursed. They don't get a fee the way they do in the United States. They only get expenses. And so I spoke to their lawyer, a wonderful woman named Michelle Flowerday, who has a real niche business in this. And I said, why do these women do it? And she said they do it because it gives them great happiness and pleasure, because a lot of them are not going to have children themselves, but they want to help other people. And this appealed to Andrew and Elad because those two also are very selfless people. They took the difficult route to get citizenship for their son. They could have gotten him a green card, but it wouldn't have been the same thing. At any rate, that's the kind of surrogacy they practice there, and it's extraordinary. And I spoke to their surrogate, a wonderful woman named Amanda, and she just said how much she loves helping them. In fact, the way that they met was that there was a social hour run by a surrogacy outfit, and it wasn't to match people. It was simply considered to be an information venue for prospective parents. But when Amanda met Andrew and Elad, she was so taken with them, and she had just delivered a baby for another couple. But she said the minute she got home, she called up that organization and said, I want Andrew and Elad. So while many couples spend months looking for a surrogate and sometimes find one and they don't get along, these three hit it off almost immediately. And so Andrew and Elad were spared the arduous process of looking for a surrogate. And in fact, Amanda wants to do this again for that couple. They have several embryos frozen that could be thawed, could be used, and she thinks, wouldn't it be great for Aiden and Ethan to have a little sister? Now, the twins are almost 7. They'll be 7 in September, and so they're getting a little bit older, and I'm not sure the parents want to do it again, but she'd do it. She'd do it because they got along so well. I mean, it was an amazing relationship.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have to use a surrogate mother, but I don't see what's wrong with being paid for that. I mean, I can see the altruistic thing. That's nice. But if somebody says, "Look, I'm going to do all this for 9 months," pay. I don't know what people get paid in the United States. Isn't it like $50,000, $100,000, something like that?
It varies across laboratories, but it's quite a bit because they always say that eggs are expensive and sperm are cheap. So you don't have. Right. I mean, I've known women who have put themselves through school by donating eggs. But
Right.
that's the policy in Canada, and it works very, very well. There are these
Hmm.
people who are just so tremendously altruistic that it gives them great pleasure to do this. And in fact, Amanda had some very interesting takes. Amanda, the surrogate, has some very interesting takes on the process. She said that she really feels happier doing this for a gay couple. And why? Because neither man ever considered being pregnant. It just doesn't happen. But she said that when she helps a childless couple, she feels bad because she can do something that the wife couldn't do.
Mm.
So she said things that I just hadn't thought of, but make so much sense. And I have all that written up in the book. I mean, I think people would really benefit from seeing that section.
Oh yeah, for sure. Really interesting. And also make a distinction between just an egg donor, just a woman that sells her eggs but doesn't carry the baby, and the egg donor who also is the surrogate mother that carries the baby.
Yeah, the egg donors are completely anonymous. The couple who looks through the different filings knows a great deal about the egg donor, about her height, her weight, her health, all these things, but not her name. Not her name.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, there's so much pushback against the idea of eugenics for good reason. But in a way, we're all pretty selective about who we want to mate with in terms of their looks and their education and their background. And I mean, that's what dating is for, right? So it's sort of a weird ethical issue there.
It certainly is. And they wanted a young donor because young donors produce more eggs. And the eggs were fertilized right away on the same day that they were produced. They were fertilized, which is supposed to be a good thing. And the math is actually quite dizzying because they started out with 40 embryos and when, every day or so they'd go down to 30, 20, like that, to find that the top two were left. And it was great that each one had one child, so to speak. But again, this couple did not care who the father was. These are the most wonderful, loving couples, best parents you could ever imagine. And one of them said to me, "We're so boring. We take our kids to Disneyland and we watch Netflix and we go to Walmart. The kids love Walmart." And he said, "The only thing different about us and other families is that we happen to be two fathers." And, Michael, when you see them in action with their boys, you forget. All you see are two parents who want to teach their children and entertain their children and supervise their children, just like parents do. They're
Hmm.
no different. And research shows that these kids turn out amazingly well. And, these kids are amazingly tolerant, very open to all kinds of things, very accepting of all kinds of people. So there are some benefits.
Yeah. Well, for sure. But I mean, all those old pre same-sex marriage legalization arguments, that a gay couple can't be as good a parents as a heterosexual couple. Why? Where's the evidence for that? And what
Yeah,
about all the crappy heterosexual parents?
yeah, well, I'll tell you, I have looked at the data. There's a lot more data on same sex female couples than there are same sex male couples. But the data that are there collectively show that these kids are just fine. And so anybody who argues that children of gay couples are less well off or less well adjusted, they're completely wrong. The data are the data. And this has been shown across studies done by different investigators with different populations. So you can't argue against the data. It's right there.
And I would think, just kind of intuitively, that anybody that goes through all that effort is going to be a energetic, involved parent, as opposed to just random people that some care, and not all of them care as much.
Well, there are data that speak to that as well. There's a large British study that showed that parents who adopt or parents who have children through in vitro fertilization or other assisted reproductive technologies have more parental satisfaction than those that have it the old fashioned way. Because,
Really?
yeah, because they have to take real measures and it costs a lot of money. It's a big investment, and the outcomes are never guaranteed. In vitro fertilization is a tricky business. And while doctors are much better at it now. It used to be that multiple embryos were implanted in the hopes that one would take, and that's what led to this increase in fraternal twinning. But nevertheless, now they really implant one embryo unless you have a really unusual reproductive history. But now one is pretty much, the way to do it. Not everyone lasts, not everyone is successful, but the vast majority of them are, and the number's growing.
Yeah. Well, that's what we did. We got lucky with the first one, and it worked But we met quite a few couples that were trying their second time, third time, and yeah, it gets expensive. It's quite an investment. Yeah, with sunk cost psychology, you put all that in there, you're less likely to give up being married and give up being a good parent and so on, and just hang in there through the trials of life.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the expense involved in 2 and 3 trials, but what about the woman's physical health? I mean, it's a big physical risk and physical
Hmm.
ordeal that she goes through. So it's something you really have to want. And I think that's what contributes to the parental satisfaction at the end.
Mm. All right, let's talk about immigration, since that's on the table politically in general. What did you learn about this whole case about our immigration system and where it works, where it doesn't work, and how complicated it is?
Well, it is complicated, although I think it's becoming more simplified. But the problem is that while there are these kind of quote unquote rules, the consular officers still have a great deal of discretion into how they get applied. So in Andrew and Alad's case, even though they were legally married and had the certificate to prove it, their case was handled as if they were not married at all. And the fact that there had to be a biological connection between one child and an American parent, but there wasn't between the other, was what was the difficult part of this case. That was another thing that was misinterpreted. Now things that now they refer to the non-biological parent as the gestational parent,
Hmm.
and the word biological is taken out of this. So that's a real plus. But on the other hand, gestational conjures up all kinds of implications as well. Gestational mean that you contributed one of the gametes or one of the sex cells, but didn't carry the baby yourself. And what does that all mean? Now, as far as I can tell, Elad was the gestational parent of both twins, even though he was only biologically connected to one. But still, there's a little bit of room for maneuver in there that the consular officer could interpret any way she wanted. So another issue that's coming up is intent of parentage. This is a question for the future that we're coming to. What if two unmarried parents or two unmarried people intend to be parents, but they don't want to get married for some reason? What happened to the citizenship of those children? And is intent strong enough to give them both citizenship, even if they're born transnationally? So there are a lot of questions that are going to be that are being raised for the future. And of course, now that Roe v. Wade was overturned, it makes things even more complicated because, you've heard Judge Thomas say that now gay marriage is threatened, and in states that are banning abortion, it could be that contraception and in vitro fertilization are threatened. Some of the gay couples I interviewed in the book were actually very concerned about this. Will they take my children away? Will they annul my marriages? These are not just, flighty concerns. These are real concerns that I think they have to think about.
Right. All right, since you mentioned abortion, give us your thoughts on that. When does life begin? You're a scientist. What's wrong with the argument? Okay, just make the pro-life argument. The biggest shift, the biggest moment is conception. All right, why not put the line right there? Anything after that is murder.
Yeah, well, there was a wonderful paper I saw about consciousness, and fetuses are not conscious. They're not. And they're not conscious actually until they're born. Now, I'm not saying that we should do abortions, at the 9th month, but I would not agree that life begins at conception. It's the beginning, perhaps, but it's not a full human being. And in fact, an interesting anecdote, there was a woman in Texas where abortions were banned, where a fetus was recognized as a person, and she was riding in the carpool lane. She was the only one in the car, but she was pregnant. And when she was
Mm.
pulled over, she said, "What? You recognize my fetus as a person? There's two of us here." So yeah. So she got back at them in that respect. Um, Abortion is a very personal uh, decision, and I think that it's up to the family, in conjunction with physicians and/or religious leaders, to make that decision. It's something that has to be left to the family. It should not be left to the government, who does not belong in the bedroom. And that's my feeling. And I think it does women and families a tremendous disservice by overturning Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. Well, I agree, but they, of course, their arguments that it's maybe not a legal person, but it's a potential person. You're killing what will be a human being. And a woman who is pregnant that wants to be pregnant doesn't describe it as medical tissue or whatever. They say, my baby. This is my future baby, right? And so the language is different and so on. It's treated differently. And I guess the problem for science is that there is no place to draw the line. I mean, you can say, well, the heartbeat or when they feel pain, when does consciousness come on board? You're right. I've seen that study about, when they're not really sentient beings until birth. Although I think most American intuitions from the latest polls I've seen is, abortion's okay in the first trimester, not okay in the third trimester. The line is drawn somewhere in that second trimester, 20 weeks or whatever.
Yeah, I think that the health of the mother certainly comes into play. I think that any woman who's considering an abortion will probably be more likely to do it early on, as soon as she knows. It would be unlikely to just wait until close to the end to decide to have one just because you don't want another child. That would be unlikely. But health of the mother can be threatened later on, and that's something that you have to consider.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how that became such a hot button political issue, particularly for Republicans, because it didn't used to be that way. Maybe it's the moral majority in the 80s that brought it on into the party. I don't know, something like that. But back then, that's when IVF was even considered immoral. I remember, I think the Catholic Church banned it, right, or condemned it.
IVF first came into being in 1978 in England, and it was introduced to this country in about 1980 or 81. And everybody said it's going to be the demise of families, it's going to ruin family structure. And you know what? All it's done is bring wonderful joy to childless couples. And nobody even thinks anything about it. People talk about it openly. I'm amazed at how many people, like you, in fact, talk about in vitro fertilization. It's not such a hush-hush private matter anymore. People mention it. And one thing no one realized is just that it's a way for gay couples to have babies, and particularly men. Sometimes gay women will, they can do other things, they can become pregnant, but that men have no other option. And so it's been a wonderful resource for them as well.
And what are the numbers now between gays and lesbians of being parents?
I don't know the exact numbers. More females than males, I know that. And in the past, more males were adopting, but now that's starting to change. And more male couples are starting to have children, as Andrew and Alaa did, through in vitro fertilization. And many of them are having twins. Some of them purposefully like to have one of yours and one of mine, something those guys did not do, but some of the couples have. And in fact, there was a great article in the New York Times maybe a year or so ago that profiled some of these male couples and the children they were having. And there were a couple of pairs of twins among them. So, yeah, it's becoming much more common these days.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would imagine the moral sphere will continue to expand and everyone will just get used to gay couples and lesbian couples having children, and that won't be a big deal anymore. And, we're making progress.
Yeah, let's hope so. One thing that I suggest in the book that occurred to me is that, you can not, suppose you don't agree with gay marriage. That's fine. You don't have to at a personal level, but you should allow people to live their lives as they see fit. And I've never heard of a gay movement that tries to deprive the rights of heterosexual couples.
Right.
Right? That's never happened. You can't have children, you can't marry. I've never heard of that, but it's only the other way around. And gay couples have had to really fight to maintain their families. And, again, as I said, if you see them, if you meet them, you quickly forget that there were two dads here. You just forget all about it. And Andrew even mentioned this in the book. He said that dinner table conversations are very important for people. It's a way of just introducing you to people and saying things and observing in ways that I think the media does not allow.
Yeah. I wonder if there's some psychological resistance to it, like with organ donations. A lot of people just are against it, and they can't really articulate a good reason why. You have two kidneys, you want to give one to your friend or whatever who is dying. What's wrong with that? Or even selling it. Most people don't think it should be sold, but there's something along the lines of, you're messing with the human body that feels wrong, eggs and organs and even sex. The resistance to prostitution, sex work, is pretty strong. Intuitively, it seems like you're selling something or trading something that should not be on that level. Like Alan Fiske's different relationships, that you have this kind of communal sharing, or between married couples or friends or whatever. You just don't put a price tag on, a spouse selling their other spouse a dinner or something. You just wouldn't do that.
Well, I think what happens is that anytime there's something different, people are resistant, and people think of all the negatives as opposed to the positives. That's what happened with IVF. It happened with human cloning. That's a whole other topic we could get into sometime. But people think of the negatives, not the positives. And, there will be negatives that we can't anticipate, but we can try to deal with them as they arise. But I think we have to focus on the positives and try to just do them as well as we can. And as I said, people were really resistant, or many people were, to the idea of IVF. And look, it's been a great thing for so many childless couples. So many children are born now that never would have come about otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess maybe it also touches on that whole eugenics thing. You're playing God, you're manipulating genes in a way. It should what's the alternative? It should just happen randomly. I mean, again, back when people date, they're not just dating randomly. They're selecting people they're attracted to for certain reasons. And, you're looking for somebody who's going to be compatible and a good father to your child, or good mother to your child, whatever, and so on. We do this anyway.
Of course. Yeah. So people don't think of that. But eventually people get used to certain ideas. And I think particularly if it affects their own life. If there was a couple that was totally against IVF but found they couldn't have a child, well, and suddenly maybe, they'll try it. It becomes a different sort of thing. People can change their minds. They really can when they see friends of theirs doing certain things. And I think it's just a matter of observing it, maybe close hand, or going through it yourself.
Yeah. So you sent me that article yesterday about the update on this particular case, and the law has been changed. So just bring us up to speed. What's the legal aspects of all this now in the United States and Canada?
You mean in terms of IVF?
The gay couples adopt doing the twins?
Well, I'm not clear on your question, Michael.
Well, you sent me that article yesterday about the kind of update on the legal aspects of how the law has changed because of this particular case that you wrote about.
Well, okay. I guess it was the change in the Foreign Affairs Manual that we were talking about. And now the word biological has been struck from the 2022 manual, replaced by the word gestational. So biological out of this. Okay, I think we talked about that before. And so that allows a lot more room for couples who are transnational, who are not the biological connectors to a particular child. So that's, I think, all for the good. But there is a woman, I can't recall her name right now, but she writes a lot about this, and she says that we should strike the word gestational from the record as well. And I tend to agree with her. I think that the best thing is just great parenting. And, it's a funny thing, because for heterosexual couples who are fertile, they can just have children, nobody cares. Adoptive families have to go through rigorous inspection, evaluations, things like that. They're observed, their mental health is evaluated, their financial resources are examined. And with in vitro, I don't think they go through that rigorous psychological process. They want to make sure the woman is healthy, but I think that whole component of evaluation is knocked out of it. One of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota, the late David Licken, thought that we ought to have licenses for biological couples, ordinary couples who want to have children, as we do for adoptees. That would never happen. That would be a very unpopular position. But I understand what he's getting at, because some adoptive parents are magnificent and some heterosexual couples make miserable parents. Mm-hmm. So I see what he's getting at, but I'm not endorsing that. I never would.
Right, of course. A license to be a parent. Right. You have to have a license to get a dog, but you can have a kid without it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really funny. All right, let's talk about the big interest in twins in general, going back to Mengele and the 19th century and all that. Must be pretty clear to everybody that there's something special about twins. So our intuition about biology matters. The relationship of parents to their children, there is some similarity there. Therefore, twins are special and so on. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a universal fascination with twins. And I've often thought, what is the basis for that? Why is it that twins make headlines when they marry each other, or unusual twins are born, or recently we've read about identical twin baseball pitchers in San Francisco. So why is this in the news so much? And I think the universal fascination comes from the fact that we all believe that we're unique, that everyone has individual differences, and that is true. But when we encounter two people who look and act so much alike, it challenges our beliefs in the way that the world works. And we find ourselves intrigued and drawn into their lives. And of course, identical twins are the closest of social relationships. That's been shown by many, many studies. And it effortlessly, they have a non-judgmental relationship, complete support, complete acceptance, something that I think all of us crave. Even people who might be put off by that kind of closeness are still intrigued. So I think that's why this is universal fascination. And of course, the twin method is very simple and very elegant. You simply compare the similarity of identical twins to the similarity of fraternal twins with regard to running speed or intelligence or personality. And identical twins are usually more alike, which is consistent with genetic influence on that trait. And when we see these things repeated in identical twins raised apart, I mean, that is very compelling evidence. As you said, I worked on the Minnesota study of twins raised apart for 9 years between 1882 and 1991. And, I'm used to twin similarities, but I have to say that it was amazing. Just in so many ways, the twins were so much alike, not just in the way they looked, but in the way they acted and the things that they said. People who just met each other. It's extraordinary. And even in their unusual habits, holding a pinky finger under a can of beer. They both did that. Now, or washing their hands before and after using the bathroom, or reading books back to front. But these things
Wasn't
are
there
not,
one who snapped a rubber band on their wrist and
one of the, yeah, they both used to wear rubber bands around their wrist. They used to collect them. Yeah.
so
And
weird.
so why is that? So the thing is that in the past, people thought that was just sort of random chance coincidence, but I don't think so. I think it's really hard scientific data because we don't see these things repeated in fraternal twins. And I think that, for example, with the books back to front, why would you do that? Maybe you're impatient. You can't wait to get to the end. It's a personality trait that is causing you to do that. Or the pinky finger under the can. Your hand is made a certain way. It's comfortable to hold it that way. Or maybe you're so afraid of spilling that precious liquid that you hold it more securely that way. But these things give us new hypotheses and fresh ways of thinking about why things are the way they are. And all of us have unusual habits, rituals, oddities, admit it. And so, why do we do those things as opposed to other ways? And we do it because it's kind of an extension of ourselves. So, I believe
Hmm.
that these things are not unusual. Now, Charles Darwin wrote about this in one of his books. Really fascinating story. There were there were some families that never met each other. One lived in England, one lived in France. But the males in both families apparently had very strong necks. And they used to put like these heavy books on their head and fling them across the room. They both did this, without knowing about the other one. So he wrote a lot about this sort of thing. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, that you
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
certain ability and you develop it a certain way in conjunction with the environmental opportunities you find yourself having.
Right. So if I look in the mirror when I'm getting dressed and certain clothes look better than other clothes, I'm going to migrate toward the ones that make me look better. If I have a twin, he's probably going to do the same thing.
Exactly.
And so we meet and we're wearing pretty similar clothes, and you're like, "What?" It's like, well, it's not that crazy, right? So, but that's just looks, kind of your physical being. But temperament, yeah, I can see that as well. So, people are born, they're just happy or not, or they're extroverted or introverted, or they're conscientious or less conscientious, agreeable, disagreeable, and so on. And at least half of that variance between people is accounted for by genes. So for twins, you're going to get an even stronger push to be similar along those traits. And then that then is another step away from the quirky little things that leads to personality
Right.
differences.
Right. But when you say there's a push to make them alike, I don't think the push comes from other people. I've challenged that whole interpretation with my
Yeah,
studies of
yeah.
unrelated lookalikes. And unrelated lookalikes are nothing alike. the same thing as identical twins raised apart, but one shares all their genes and one shares none of their genes. If personality was simply a function of how people responded to you based on your appearance, there should be no difference in similarity between those two kinships. And yet it's vastly different. The unrelated lookalikes have a zero correlation, basically. And the identical twins raised apart about 0.5. So it's that I think identical twins probably are treated more alike, but they evoke similar treatment from other people.
And people are also uncomfortable with the idea that things like intelligence can be heritable. Because if there's group differences, then that must mean we can't do something about the group differences because it's biological. And you know that whole line of arguments that eugenicists use, that people that are resistant to that for good reason then want to throw out all the genetics component, heritability component to anything like that.
Yeah, but I think that what has to get across is that individual differences can be genetic, that is within groups. Between groups, they might be environmental, and you can't just go from one to the other. If you want to talk more about the Mengele twins, I know we sort of strayed away from that.
Yeah, let's do that.
We should get back to that. So in 1985, it was actually 1984, I was out in California from Minnesota as a postdoc then, and I heard on the radio about this reunion of Holocaust twins, the survivors of the Mengele experiments, that was going to take place that January of 85 at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And they mentioned that some twins were going there hoping to find their brother or sister. So, as a Jewish twin myself, I knew that another time, another place, I could have been standing on that railroad ramp. And it was one of those situations, Michael, where I just knew I was going. I didn't know how, what, but I knew I was going. And I was really happy that the professors back in Minnesota, Norman Garmezy, Thomas Bouchard, some others, really supported me and gave me the financial support that I needed. There's a whole story in the book about where we got the money from, and it's kind of fun to read that. But I went with them, and it was a gathering that was unlike any I'd ever gone to. I'd been to academic conferences before, but this was one where your data were all around you, and it was very, very emotional. People confronting a past that they didn't know they could share with others. Everyone figured they were the only twin alive, but there were actually 9 twins who came to Auschwitz, and then there were probably 30 or more that showed up at Yad Vashem, and it's estimated that 157 survived. That was 85. Of course, a number of them had passed away. But I felt that it was so important to get their story because some of them are getting much older. Now, when I was there, I took a lot of photographs. I took probably 300 photographs of Auschwitz-Birkenau. I got the first picture of Elie Wiesel when he came back to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Wonderful picture. He was accompanied by the late Peter Jennings. And I happened to just leave my group and find him, and it's an amazing photograph. And there's a whole story about Elie Wiesel because there's 3 meetings I've had with him after that. You would have read the book. But at any rate, and then I went on to Yad Vashem.
There it is. There's the picture.
Yeah, that's
nice.
it. So I went on to Yad Vashem for a 3-day public hearing on Mengele's war crimes. And then in June of 85, it was revealed that Mengele had died by drowning in southern Brazil. So there was an inquest held in November of that year to review the forensic evidence, and some top government officials showed up at that. So I went to all of those things, photographed them all. And then I kept up with some of the twins later on at some of their informal gatherings. I have to say I'm not a photographer, but the money that I was able to put together allowed me to buy a really good Nikon camera, and I was very lucky. I shot some amazing photographs, but more than that, it was during COVID when I was finishing up Deliberately Divided, and I found these photographs sitting in my closet, and I was so disgusted, and I thought, what are they doing there? They have to be out. No one's ever published these things. And a small Jewish press, Academic Studies Press, thought it was a great project. And for me, it was different than anything I'd ever done. I really wanted to do mostly photographs because they speak for themselves. I do have a little text in there to provide context and information, but that's it. And I'm very proud of that book, and it's gotten a lot of attention. I've had a lot of invitations to speak about it. And in fact, I don't know if you know this, but in July, middle July, I got an email from the son of the world's oldest surviving Mengele twin. She's 99, and she's in the book.
Wow.
I got to know them very well. Annetta Abel. Her sister lived till 95, Steffa, and I have written about them in a number of places and met with them in Melbourne twice. But her son emailed to say that they were having a book launch for her at a Jewish center. She'd just written a book called The Mosaic of My Life. He didn't expect me to come. He sent it more out of courtesy, but he doesn't know me. I was on the next plane to Melbourne. I went there for 2 days, for a 2-hour event. And it was worth every minute of it. It was just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. She's beautiful. She's lovely. And I'm reading the book now. It's wonderful. So
Look at these. Look at these. I love this picture of these twins here. Wow.
Which one is that? Which one are you showing?
That's the Miriam and Eva. Eva Kor and Miriam Zeiger.
Yeah, but are you showing the one on the bottom of the page or the top?
Oh, the bottom. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture, but I actually like the one on the top even better. Which
let's see that.
Cover.
Yeah.
And let me explain what that is.
Yeah.
In the twins' barracks, there's a still photograph of a film that was made by the Soviet troops at the time of liberation. And it turns out that in that still, there's a pair of 9-year-old twins who happen to be Eva and Miriam. And so I was able to position themselves in front of each other at the age of 49, 40 years later. And it was very dark in there, and I didn't know if my flash was going to be able to handle it. But fortunately, a television cameraman came by with a big strobe light and was willing to wait for a couple of minutes till I got the picture. And it's kind of like an unusual time-lapse photography. But what it shows to me is the strength and resilience that these twins had and the personal fortitude to go back and confront the past and to show that they were able to withstand that horror and to build meaningful and productive lives. That's what the picture embodies for me.
Yeah. Were they angry or bitter or resentful or sad or?
There's a whole complex mix of emotions, and some twins show more anger and sadness than others. But I think that all of them certainly are very sad at the fact that their lives were destroyed, their childhoods were stolen, as I said in the subtitle, their family members perished. A lot of them went back, and you have to wonder, why would they want to go back there? A lot of them brought their children, because these are the grave sites of their family members. But there's a mix of emotions, and I think they were very glad to actually share their stories finally. Many of them have gone into Holocaust education. They still have their moments where they see a piece of bread and it brings back all kinds of horrors. Or as Annetta and her twin sister Steffa said, one day in the camps we saw, in the midst of all the horror, a little tiny yellow flower. And they said it was a little bit of ray of hope. And whenever they see a little yellow flower, it makes them kind of sad and yet sort of happy at the same time, that there's always some humanity and hope behind the horror. Some of them are more bitter than others, sure. And see, now the problem is that many of them are older and they're experiencing medical problems, and they don't know if their medical problems are linked to their medical experimentation at Auschwitz or the normal aging process. And as one twin told me, she's a she's an elderly, upper middle class woman living in Skokie, Illinois, and she developed tuberculosis. And that's just not a disease that you get in Skokie. And her physician was baffled by it. Could it have been something from Auschwitz? It's possible. Another twin showed multiple sclerosis at the age of 50 or 60. That's a disease that usually develops in late teens or early 20s. Again, where does it come from? No answers.
Right. Yeah. Well, they may never know. You have this genealogy chart here in the book from, genealogy charts defining who is a Jewish child. So the Nazis had this whole race science of how to classify people that way.
Yes, and they classified it according to that diagram that if you had two grandparents who were Jewish, you were a Jewish child. And I believe one classified you as a non-Aryan, but fewer than two, you were not Jewish. That actually comes from a French newspaper, but interestingly, there's an incredible comprehensive Auschwitz exhibit right now at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley that I went to a couple of weeks ago. And that same kind of genealogy was there, and it seems to match very well with what I have. So I feel that's probably fairly truthful.
Yeah. Well, that was all discussed at the Wannsee conference when they were deciding the final solution to the Jewish problem. And it came up, well, who exactly are we exterminating? Because everybody has an exception. right? And so Himmler has that famous speech, the Poznan speech we have on tape, where he's going through all this. Like, we can't be soft here and think we have some of the good Jews or the bad Jews or the half Jews or whatever. We just have to get rid of all of them. It's very, yeah, it's very moving. So that Reagan exhibition is pretty good. I saw some ads for that.
Yeah, it's huge, and it takes 3 to 4 hours to get through it, and it's very exhausting, but very informational and very educational. Some of the artifacts came from Auschwitz, and I will say that I found they made a greater impact on me when I was at Auschwitz. Maybe that's because I saw them for the first time, but I saw them where they were actually used. I remember in Auschwitz there was a big case of shoes that had been taken by the prisoners or from the prisoners. There was a big case of eyeglasses and hairbrushes that had been taken, and a huge casement of suitcases. And that really hit hard the most because names were on those suitcases. And those are real people. Now, some of that stuff was at the Reagan Library, and it certainly has a great impact. But for me, it made a greater impact when I was at Auschwitz. Why do they have these things? Because when the prisoners came there, they were told to be taking a shower. So leave your belongings here, and you'll get them at the end. But of course, the shower was really exposure to the Zyklon B gas, which caused suffocation in a matter of minutes. So all their belongings were left outside. And then there were some elite prisoners called Sonderkommando who had certain skills that were needed to keep the camp going. And there were some who were assigned to gather this stuff up and sort it out. And that, of course, was a very difficult kind of thing to do. But they were all brought to a place in the camp called Canada, which was associated with great wealth. So that's where the material was found. Some prisoners were given the job of sorting bodies, and some of them found bodies of people they knew. I mean, you can imagine the trauma that affected a lot of these people. One young twin said to me that she saw dead bodies all around and figured that was the norm. I mean, this is the childhood that they grew up with. That was supposed to be the norm. And when she found out that's not the norm, she had to revise her way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, I went to Auschwitz in the 90s when Alex Groban and I were writing our book, Denying History. And yeah, it's very disturbing to see all that. I mean, just huge displays of shoes and glasses and hair, and the suitcases and all that. Yeah, it's pretty moving. Yad Vashem had some of that as well, if I recall.
Yes, and what Yad Vashem has, also, I should mention this, there was an older twin who was in charge of the twin boys. His name was Zvi Spiegel, and he was 29 when he came to the camps. He had a twin sister, Magda, and she has a totally different story. But at any rate, at the end of the war, well, first of all, while he was there, he was given the task of making the twins available for experiments, which he had to do. But he also made sure that all the twin boys knew each other and knew their names, and he taught them some history and geography at the same time. And they used to think of him as a father. At the end of the war, he escorted 50 of those boys back to their hometowns, walking with them along the way. They picked up other homeless children on the trip. And he kept a handwritten list of the names of the boys that he took back. And that list is on display at Yad Vashem, and I have a picture of it in the book. And during the testimony at Yad Vashem, one of the panelists, there was a distinguished panel of 7 people who heard the testimony. One of the panelists said, "Are any of the twin boys here that went back with Spiegel?" And there were 8 of them. And they all stood up, and the applause was deafening, as you can imagine. Absolutely amazing. It was an amazing moment. It really was.
Yeah. Yeah, the ethical dilemmas some of these people were put through when I read about the accounts of the Sonderkommandos, who are a good source of evidence for how the Holocaust actually, not only that it happened, but exactly how it came about, because they said, here's what we did. But, they're Jews having to do these things, clean out the gas chambers and take the clothes and this and that. But really, they're just given a choice. You're going to die or else you're going to do this. So I guess you just hope I'll just do it and hope that it comes to an end before I have to do it anymore.
But also, they were no safer, really. I mean, after a while, they would know too much, and sometimes they were killed. One of the best accounts I read by a person in the Sonderkommando was by Dr. Miklos Nitzli, who was a physician in the camps. And his job was to do dissections of twins. And what Mengele would do was a bizarre form of what's called co-twin control, where you subject identical twins to different treatments or training. And so Mengele would sometimes inject typhus in one twin, not the other, wait a while, kill them both, and compare their healthy and diseased organs. And Nitzli writes a lot about this. It's an amazing little book. absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone interested in this, I would suggest that book. It's extraordinary. It's very slim,
Yeah.
but very informative and very difficult to read at times. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think the whole idea of childhood memory too, Michael, is one that is important to touch upon because a lot of these twins were children at the time, and so we all know that memory is fallible, that people create scenarios and remember things in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also talked to specialists who work with children of trauma who have told me that in very safe, secure surroundings, children's memories can sometimes be restored. And so I remember that before going on the trip, I met in New York City with two of the twins, Renee and Irene Slotkin, and another twin, Peter Salmaji, who came, but his twin brother did not. And both Renee and Irene were very young at the time. They were 5 or 6 in the camps, and they didn't have much recollection of things they said. And as we're talking and talking, in the middle of the conversation, Irene suddenly screams out, Mengele was wearing green boots. Now,
Really?
yeah, that's something that could be checked.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, at the Reagan exhibit, there's a little quote on the wall where she's saying Mengele wore green boots. And I often wonder sometimes if they didn't get it from one of my papers because I wrote that in there. I don't know where else they would have heard of it. And the other thing that was extraordinary was Peter Samaji, who had been older. He was 12 in the camps. His wife, who was there, told me that he never spoke about his experience to his children and never spoke about it to her. They just knew that he had been there, and that's all they knew. Well, I saw Peter pull out a piece of paper and a pencil and draw a map of the camps, and his wife looked on in disbelief. In disbelief.
Wow.
And I,
Wow.
I kept that paper for many years.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It was
Yeah, I'd
incredible.
also recommend the Posner's book, Gerald Posner's biography of Mengele, and then Tricia Posner's book on the pharmacist of Auschwitz, which is really quite an amazing story.
Yeah, I've read both of those, and they both
Mm.
are extraordinary. The Posners now have a foundation for education. I think Holocaust and racism, and so yeah, they're starting that out, which
Do
is
we know
great.
how many total twins
Well,
Mengele saw?
that's a great question, and I think we'll never get to a correct answer. I've seen some entries where there were 3,000 pairs, meaning 15. I'm sorry, 1,500 pairs, which is 3,000 twins. I've seen 700. And then the other thing, Michael, is that there were some twins, or some pairs of people who were considered twins and were not really twins at all. And I write about them in the book. There was a man, Ephraim Reichenberg, who came to Auschwitz with his brother Laszlo. Now, they have the same genetic relationship as fraternal twins, but they're not twins. But they looked a lot alike. And the Nazi officers said, you two must be twins. Let's go to the barracks. And they said, we're not twins. But they went there anyway. And apparently Laszlo had a beautiful singing voice. And the officers wanted to know why Ephraim didn't have the same. And so they put all kinds of noxious chemicals into his throat, and he couldn't breathe and he couldn't swallow. And when he went to Israel years later, he had all kinds of growths on his vocal cords. So they were removed, and he had to speak with the assistance of an electronic device, which ironically is German made. He came to Auschwitz. I have a picture of him holding this to his neck where he's engaging us in prayer. And he speaks in a very tinny kind of way, but he can still speak. It's just that it sounds rather unusual. But I know of at least 3 or 4 other cases of unrelated people who were considered to be twins. In fact, Zvi Spiegel saved the lives of 2 boys by just saying, look, here's your birthday. That's it. And they were safe for a while. I want to point out that the twins were safer for a while and better fed for a while. Eventually, they could be killed in this horrific experimentation that Mengele had in place. But being a twin kept you alive for a while.
Right. On the ethical issue, I don't know if you read Annie Jacobson's book on Operation Paperclip. And these were all the Nazi scientists that were brought to the United States after the war. If you got a paperclip on your file, it means you get to work for the U.S. government in an intelligence agency or whatever capacity, depending on your field. You were a biologist or chemist or physicist, and so forth. And a lot of these guys, mostly guys, would have been otherwise tried for war crimes at Nuremberg, considering what they were participating in. But because we had the Cold War race was starting up, and we wanted to have chemical weapons and biological weapons and nuclear weapons and rocketry and so on. We kind of gave Werner von Braun is the most famous case of this, but there's like 1,000 of these guys.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of these Nazi officers were never brought to trial, and in fact, Mengele is one of them. And he slipped through the hands of the Americans on at least one occasion. Ended up in Brazil, and at the hearing in 1985 at Yad Vashem, Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, was there. And it was his belief that Mengele had escaped to Paraguay and was under the protection of then General Stroessner. That turned out to be not the case. He was hiding under a false name in this little farm in southern Brazil, an area called Embu, and that's where he drowned. But he was never brought to justice, and that's something that I think really hurts the twins. And when they met each other at Auschwitz and at Yad Vashem, that was the glue that held them all together. They were so fiercely united in their quest to find him and bring him to justice, so that when the drowning was revealed, it kind of dissolved things, which is really unfortunate. And that's how it's been. There was one more trip back to Auschwitz by the twins that I understand took place. I did not go, but I will say that Eva Kor did construct a museum in Terre Haute, Indiana, her hometown, and it's called the Candles Museum. Candle stands for Children of Auschwitz, Nazis' Deadly Laboratory Experiment Survivors. And they have educational programs there and exhibits, and I'll be speaking there September 23rd. I've been invited to speak out there about my book, and so I'm excited about that. I'm curious to see the Candles Museum. I've never been there before.
Yeah.
I know it was vandalized once, but she rebuilt it. She was a strong woman, Eva Kor.
Yeah, Alex and I went to a bunch of these sites. Majdanek is still intact. You can go into the gas chambers and so on, see the Zyklon B staining on the walls. And it's really disturbing to walk around these places. We went to Mauthausen, which was a labor camp, not an extermination camp. If I recall, there's not much left of Treblinka and Sobibor. I think they were destroyed before the war ended.
There's quite a bit left of Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, but of course, that was more of a family camp. But it's chilling to see it, because you see these windows with lace curtains, and you wonder, how could people live there now? I mean, with all these ghosts floating around. But you mentioned Majdanek, which is where experiments took place on hypothermia, because the Nazis wanted to find out what it was like to revive a soldier or a pilot who had been shot down. And so what they did to the poor Jews who were emaciated and hardly representative of the human condition was to get them into a near drowning situation in freezing cold water, and try to revive them. And so when I was at Minnesota, there was a question as to, should you use these data? I mean, is there anything in there that should be used? What message does it send? And I guess the consensus, and this is my feeling also about data that are conducted in an unethical fashion, is that it sends the wrong message to future scientists. It sends the message that, well, you can go down that slippery slope one day, but it's okay because then the data will be valuable later on. I can't believe that there's anything in those data that would be better than what we can get today through more refined, more sophisticated methodologies. Now, having said all that, let's suppose that something in those data could save a life. Of course, you would use it, but you'd have to be very careful in implementing it and make sure that you add a lot of disclaimers. But it's really hard for me to believe that those data could be used, just like in my book, Deliberately Divided, which was about the data collected on the intentionally separated twins in the New York City twin study that was engineered by Louise Wise and the Child Development Center study. These were twins who had data from birth until the age of 12, collected several times a year. And it's on in the archives at Yale. Should we use those data? I don't think so, because we have much better twin methodology right now and much better data on more representative cases. It would send the wrong message.
Yeah. Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. In the Operation Paperclip book, she talks about early aviation medicine and the study of aviation physiology of pilots at high altitudes and things like that. A lot of the earliest stuff came from the Nazis, or the people that we stole basically before the Russians got them. I mean, I guess that's the ethics of that, right? If we hadn't gotten these scientists, the Russians would have and used the knowledge anyway. But it's still pretty dicey what happened there.
It's pretty dicey. And, I think that some people have asked me, why didn't you do more on the medical experiments in your book? And the reason I didn't was because I wanted to really bring out the humanity of the twins. Many people know there are these Mengele twins, but they don't know
Yeah.
about the twins themselves. And I really wanted the photographs and minimal text to really be what they would see. And in fact, the medical experiments are written up in many, many places. They're written up in countless books. And Robert J. Lifton wrote a book way back, I think in the early 80s, called The Nazi Doctors, which has quite a bit of material in there too.
Yeah. Nancy, you're a psychologist. You've spent your whole career studying the human condition, human nature, and society, and so forth. How could something like this happen in a cultured, educated people like Germans?
Michael, it's a great question, and we can only speculate as to how that happens. But I think that because it was sanctioned by doctors, this gave other people the approval, so to speak, to go ahead and carry these things out. Um, when you talk to some people, you read about them, they all say, I was just doing my job. I was just told by superiors. They're not taking responsibility. Some people didn't go along with it, and I applaud them, but many, many did. So I think that with the sanction of the doctors, and we all think doctors are gods in many ways. I don't think so anymore. I suppose I used to at one time, but many people do. That's how it got carried out. Um, it was at a time when Germany had lost World War I. People were starving. Financial situations were very poor. And Hitler gave people some ray of hope. And little by little, they went along with things. When it's gradual, I think that people don't realize. And when you're not the targeted group, perhaps it's easier to go along with these things. Many Jews knew they were being targeted, but they could hardly believe that Germany would do this kind of a thing. I mean, it's just beyond comprehension. And yet people want to hang on to power, and people do that. And again, it's someone told me to do this. I'm just doing my job, or I would be in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is some of that. I think there's multiple factors at work there. It's an escalation game in game theory that 15 volts at a time in Milgram's experiment. You kind of you're going down the path like, oh, I hope this experiment ends soon. All right, I'll push one more 15 volts, one more 15 volts. Maybe it'll end. You're kind of hoping. You see that in the original Milgram videos. And I saw this when we replicated Milgram for that 2010 Dateline NBC. We actually rebuilt the box and had this followed the same script, and we had people coming in to try out for this reality TV show called What a Pain. And they were going to see, we just did it exactly like Milgram did. But all of our subjects, they were not happy doing it. You could see them squirming and like, are you sure? And I don't really want to do this. And our actor is going, you must continue the experiment. I have to? Yes, you have. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But they didn't want to. And, my sense is that most people don't want to do this, but for half a dozen reasons, maybe they go along with it.
Well, because, people I don't know who your subjects were exactly, but if an investigator does it, well, then it must be okay. If you allow that it's okay.
Yeah, in our case, this was, it's set up by Dateline NBC. They had to be thinking, well, I can't actually be hurting somebody. It's for a television network.
Exactly. But here's another thing. You have to, I sometimes think to myself, what would Mengele have been like if the Holocaust has never happened? He probably would have been a very sadistic, mean professor at a university. After all, he had a PhD and an MD. So he was a very educated man. But that's probably what it would have been like. In the climate of Auschwitz, he had unlimited possibilities for research. There were no controls on him. He had access to twins. He was fascinated by people with genetic anomalies. There was a man with polydactyly, an extra finger, who fascinated Mengele. And Mengele was so angry when the man died. He was fascinated by a family of 10 children, 7 of whom were dwarfed. I have an amazing picture in the book, what was called the Lily.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
Right.
And these were people who would sing and perform in their hometowns. But at Auschwitz, they were forced to sing naked for the Nazi officers. Their feces were examined, their teeth were extracted. I mean, for what purpose? So many of these experiments were done in a whimsical kind of way. And that gets to another question, Michael. Why the experiments? Why were they done? There's 2 schools of thought on that. One is that they were done to increase the twinning among the Aryans, to make the population larger. But my question there is, if that were the case, you would study the parents, not the twins. Then the next issue, which I think is right, is that he was trying to show the superiority of the Aryans by showing genetically based differences among them. And so if he could say, well, this is superior to that, then he could make a case. But looking at his experimentation, I don't think he could answer either question. I really don't think so. But I think that the second one is closer to the truth. And it's also been pointed out that he did experiments and studies that were sort of typical of regular anthropometric research. He did heights and weights and face width. And I mean, those are things that I've done on twins. But then he crossed this terrible line where he would inject people with substances. And he was fascinated when parents and children had different eye colors, and he'd extract eyes when the people were dead and send them up to Berlin. And he had a contact at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin named von Verschuur. And when I first heard about von Verschuur, I was shocked because in the classic textbooks on twins from the 20s and 30s, von Verschuur is referred to as a distinguished European student of twins, but he was Mengele's collaborator. And he would process all these materials. He got government grants that allowed Mengele to do the kind of work he did. I mean, it was horrifying. And he was killed in a car accident, von Verschuur was. And apparently he destroyed all his material. His records have never been found. And if they have been found, they've been concealed, but they've never been found as far as I know.
If I recall from Posner's book, Mengele would have thought of himself, had we won the war, I would have been a hero and won the Nobel Prize in medicine, or something like that.
Yeah, there was a woman who was a Polish doctor in the camps. She was not Jewish. She was a prisoner there because she and her husband had helped Jews to escape. And she said that while she didn't take part in the research, Mengele would talk to her about his twin studies. And she said he was so afraid that they would get into the wrong hands. He was very protective of those twin studies, just worried that someone would steal his data. But how he ever hoped to publish it, it boggles the mind.
I just think he had to be at least the dark triad: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, and anything else sadistic, probably some sadism in there as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's shown in the way he treated some of these children. He could be very kind to them one minute, give them candy and hug them, and the next minute he'd have them on the ground and somebody would shoot them. That's how he was.
Yeah, because I don't want to think that civilization is just this thin veneer over this dark human nature in which all of us are capable of this. Some people are more capable of doing these things than others. There are certain characteristics. When you add them up, you end up with the Mengeles and the Hitlers or the Stalins of the world. Most people are not like that.
Yeah, I would agree. Mengele was one of 23 doctors at Auschwitz. He was not the lead doctor, but he's the one that we all know about. And so he was known because of what he did. But the other doctors, we don't know about them as well. Who knows if they tried to hide some of their things? It's possible. But at any rate, Mengele is the one known as the Angel of Death. He's the one everybody remembers.
Yeah, it's too bad he wasn't brought to justice. How do his victims come to grips with that? I mean, if you're religious, you think, well, there's an afterlife. He'll get his, in the next life. But if you don't believe that, then
well, I don't think the twins believe that. I think that the twins are very upset.
Yeah.
That Mengele was never brought to justice. I mean, he is the one person that really deserved to go on trial. And the mock hearing was great. I mean, it really was. That's not evidence that would probably hold up in a court of law, but there's a lot of testimony that was given by a lot of the people there. And in fact, it's been published in a journal, but unfortunately in a rather obscure Holocaust studies journal. I found it only by looking really hard for it. But that's the kind of stuff that needs to get out there. And Mengele will never be brought to trial. It's unfortunate. When they found the body, this was another thing. They didn't have the up-to-date forensic tools that they have now, but they had pretty good ones then. And you couldn't prove conclusively it was Mengele, but everything was consistent with it. The height, the weight, I mean, all these things. One thing that they did not find was that Mengele had osteomyelitis, which should have left scarring in the bones. They didn't see evidence of that. But some doctors say it doesn't necessarily leave evidence. Mengele also never had dental x-rays taken, which was very smart because he never wanted to be identified. So they couldn't go by that. Now, he had a son, Rolf, who was, I think, an attorney in Bavaria. And they were able to match some DNA samples. But see, the problem there is that you can disprove paternity, but you can't prove it. And even while Mengele's DNA was compatible with Rolf's, he could have been the father. It doesn't prove that he was.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that documentary about him meeting with his father. Gerald was part of that, Posner, setting that up. Oh, there's a great clip of Gerald on the Donahue show in which they have the son Rolf and Gerald sitting there at the table together. It's really quite revealing.
Yeah, I have a picture of Gerald with a Dutch resistance fighter who were both at the panel at the inquest in Terre Haute in November of 1985. And Gerald is delivering the final statement that the panel drew upon conclusion of that event. So those things were very important. I think, Michael, the problem with that inquest, it was held in November in Terre Haute, Indiana, in a huge arena. I don't think we took up more than the first 2 rows. It was so awful. It should have been held in the spring in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, where they had the population. No one's going to go to Terre Haute in November. That was the problem. It was an event. I mean, they had top-notch experts. They had John Loftus. They had Michael Baden. They had David Marwell. They had some dignitary from Venezuela. I mean, and a lot of the twins were there. They had incredible people at this.
What was the purpose of the event?
It was to review the forensic evidence that Mengele had died. Because the twins were divided as to whether that was really him or whether it was just a hoax. They said, well, he could have gotten a body and substituted it. And so while I say that all the measurements on that body were consistent with Mengele, it was not done blindly. See, they knew that was Mengele. It should have been done blindly, but that's the way it goes. Anyway,
well, it's like all the conspiracy theories about Hitler he didn't actually kill himself in the bunker and he's escaped to Argentina or whatever. Again, I think there's just a sense of we want justice and hope.
I think that's right.
I bet your twins were hoping it wasn't Mengele so that he's still alive. We can get him.
Of course they were. Of course they were. And as I said, this is what gave them such cohesion in terms of their goals. And once Mengele was dead, it kind of unraveled a little bit. So, yeah, that would have been important. And it's just that it's too bad that it never did. It's really too bad.
Yeah. On the question of how identical twins are, aren't there some certain amount of randomness that goes on even genetically or in the womb? And
yes. Oh yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, in terms of environmental biological influences, one twin can get more nutrition than the other. They can develop the transfusion syndrome where one literally bleeds into the other and create enormous differences in health and size. In terms of genetics, there can be spot mutations that occur in the womb or after. And I think a fair percentage of twins do have them. There was an amazing paper that came out from Iceland, I think at the end of 2022, maybe the beginning of 2023, that talked about this, how most twins are not strictly genetically identical. But what impresses me is that despite these differences, they're still amazingly alike. So the importance of these differences may not really make much of a difference. But it is amazing how the correlations between identical twins are far from one. Schizophrenia is about a 40% similarity, multiple sclerosis 50%, diabetes 50%. It's not high. Autism is the highest. That's about 80%.
Really?
Yeah, autism's the highest. And of course, it depends on whether you use strict or general criteria or blood criteria.
You mean if one twin is autistic, there's an 80% chance the other one will be?
That's correct. That's correct. Okay. Yeah, and the heritabilities are about like that. But for schizophrenia, 40%. I mean, it's rather remarkable. And breast cancer in women, 20%. Really, really low. You expect that to be higher. But that shows, and Alzheimer's disease is another one where one twin might have it and the other one might not. It's extraordinary.
Right, because you think of, everything is heritable, right? The first law of behavior genetics, everything has a heritability component to it at some level. But then, depending on how strong it is, even identical twins raised in the same environment, same home, they're not identical. So then, let's introduce Frank Sulloway's, a model of Darwinian model of siblings trying to be different, to carve out a niche to get parental attention and love in competition with the other siblings in the family dynamic, forcing them to try to be slightly different.
Yeah, I know. And I think that's quite possible. In fact, I tried to use his theory with twins, but there simply weren't enough in terms of firstborn, secondborn, all that in reared parts. But I will say that, sure, I think that twins do try to carve out a niche for themselves within a family. But nevertheless, when you do the studies, identical twins are still more alike than fraternal twins. So you get the greatest amount of information from the many, not from the few.
Yeah, sure.
Many people say to me, I know identical twins and they're so different. Well, maybe at an individual level, there may be some differences, but they're still remarkably alike. So that's the interesting part. And when you see identical twins who differ, say, in disease, I mean, this is fascinating information because you can then say, why does one have it and why does one not have it? And that's information you can use in the way of prevention for the non-twin population.
Let's think about how something like political orientation can have a heritability component, whether you lean right or left, say. Now, we know genes, program for proteins and chemicals and hormones, and this changes and directs personality development. So maybe you're high on conscientiousness, low on agreeableness, or I don't know what. You tend to be fearful around new environments. You don't like to travel as much. Strangers are a little more anxiety prone. So maybe then you are nudged toward being anti-immigration, or you're more pro-family, or you prefer a tighter culture versus a looser culture. Yeah, you see where I'm going with this, right? So
I do.
in other words, you don't pick your orientation randomly or by the facts. You just go, these are my people. I feel more comfortable with this political orientation than that one.
That's right.
By my temperament.
And it's amazing how many children don't go along with their parents' political orientations or opinions. That children are similar to parents maybe when they're young and living at home, but once they're free to express their genetic potential and to gravitate toward people, places, and things that they find most compatible, they may find that their parents' beliefs in social attitudes and political issues very different than their own. And siblings within a family, too. A home environment may objectively be the same for two siblings, but filtered through the lens of each child, it's extremely different. Computers may excite one child, whereas sports equipment excites the other. So the home environment is very, very different for children. We all pick our particular poisons. We pick our own environments. We craft them as we do, and that's why, Michael, when they looked at religiosity in young twins, they found no genetic component because everybody was doing what their parents wanted, and identicals were as alike as fraternals. But once you got out of the home, then the genetic effects began to be clear.
Right. It's like that book, The Nurture Assumption. Who's the author again?
Judith
Rich Harris. Yes.
Yes.
Right. It wasn't that parents don't matter. Of course, parents matter. But in terms of measurable effects in the outcome of a life, they matter less than you would think.
Yes. And so I think I was actually in a debate in New York City about this. The resolution was parenting is overrated. And I said yes. And it's not that I think parenting doesn't matter. I think it matters a great deal, but not in the way that we think it is, or we think it does. I think parenting matters in that parents need to stay responsive and sensitive to each child's natural proclivities, to nurture the child's abilities, to help the child overcome difficulties. And that's where parents play such a role. And if the parents don't play that kind of role, I think it's a mistake. Parents who expect their children to follow in the family business or become a great dancer like they are, I think might be in trouble.
Yeah.
So I think what you want to do is make your child or help your child to become the best that they can be.
As a parent, I agree. I always thought it was just ridiculous, this idea of I want my kid to be like me. Why? They're not you. Or, my kid's got to get into Harvard. Really? Is that for you or the kid? Right? Well, and in any case, it's this idea that what I'm doing now, the only reason it matters is some outcome 20 years from now. What about now? Just why not be a good parent now? Why? Just because it's good to be loved as a child now, today, that I have a nice life today. I have something to eat. I have some love and attention in a stimulating environment right now. Forget 20 years from now. Who knows what's going to happen?
The great thing about humans is that we can thrive and prosper in many, many different situations as long as we have basic needs met: security, nutrition, love. and we can prosper in many, many different situations. And that also comes back to the idea of gay parenting. The gay parenting provides love, security, nurturance, all resources to children, and they can thrive. Children thrive in orphanages if they have that. They thrive in all kinds of situations. So I think we have to keep that in mind. I mean, the nuclear family is held up as this great goal that we all have to attain, this gold standard, but it's just one situation of many. It's one of many.
Right. Right. What was that book? Mother Nature, the anthropologist.
Sarah Hrdy?
Sarah Hrdy. Yes. Right. There's just lots and lots of different ways to raise children. There's just not one way. Yeah. I wanted to ask you too about the Nobel Prize sperm bank, and back to this idea of, why can't we have genetic programs or eugenics or something that works for racehorses and dogs? Why can't it work for people? And that was a very controversial thing.
Well, I
Was
don't
his
think
name
it worked.
Graham?
Yes. No, Shockley. Wasn't Shockley the one with the Nobel Prize sperm bank?
I think he was part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But at any rate, first of all, um, parents or great ability is a result of interactions among many, many genes that come from the maternal and paternal sides. And so these things tend to dissolve in subsequent generations. And so that's why I think people who rely on these Nobel Prize sperm banks are going to be disappointed. And I don't know that for horses and dogs it necessarily works that same way either. I know less about that, but I know that for humans, things are very, very different. There are going to be some similarities. If you use the same sperm for different children as they do for these half-sibling donors. I mean, there's families all over the place that now have related half-siblings because they use the same sperm donors. But there's no guarantee. Even, if we would ever do human reproductive cloning, even though you could make a genetically identical child to an adult, there's no guarantee that they'd be the same. The environment might be different. I personally think they'd be pretty similar, but still, the environment would be the same, wouldn't be the same. The intrauterine environment wouldn't be the same. There'd be a lot of things that would be different. Certain things, certain skills might not be valued. Everybody talks about the Michael Jones cloning court, but I mean, maybe basketball wouldn't be such a great thing years later. Who knows? It might not be pickleball is getting pretty popular.
Pickleball. Remember that movie Boys from Brazil about the cloning
sure.
of Hitler? Yeah.
Oh, sure.
As if, if you could just have 20 different factors come together at the right time, you're going to have that person. You're not. It'd be 20 million different things, have contingencies along the pathway.
Yes, but keep in mind, Michael, that when we look at twins raised apart, I mean, they're pretty similar. And they're pretty similar in personality. There is a like in personalities, identical twins raised together. And that's a hard observation to get your head around. But the data don't lie, and it's a counterintuitive observation. But what it tells us is that what makes family members alike who are living together are their shared genes and not their shared environments.
Yeah.
I also study virtual twins. Virtual twins are same age, unrelated children raised together from birth. And they're not alike at all. They're completely different.
Yeah. Well, just my answer to this eugenics argument is that if you have too much inbreeding, that the genes are too similar, you're going to get some pleiotropic effects that you don't want. Like dogs and racehorses or whatever that are physically not healthy because of too much inbreeding. Or just take it with humans, all those European kings and queens, all cousins marrying each other for centuries, and you had pretty inept people with physical problems.
Yeah, well, it's an inbreeding depression. When close relatives marry, the chance of lethal recessives coming together is highly possible. And so, yeah, it's 25%. So that's why you'd see these kinds of effects in royal families that did do a lot of inbreeding.
Yeah. And the idea that you could select, one set of characteristics you are hoping to breed for, say IQ score, something like that. Why would you think in 20 years that's going to be the factor that determines whether somebody's successful or not? It's one factor, but there's 100 others. And, don't forget about temperament and, and personality and all that.
Yeah, and motivation. Many, many things come into play with something like that. Yeah, and finding the right talent and the right opportunity to exercise that talent. All of us have a lot of abilities, I think, that we never know about because we've never had a chance to try them. Something to think
Right.
about. Yeah, and who knows, another time, another place, who knows what you might have done. But, we do the best with what we can at the time.
Right. That's again why diversity is so good, but just diversity of just trying different things to figure out what you're good at or not good at. Because most things you try, you will not be good at. You will fail at most things. So you can just find the one, right? That's all you can hope for.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
you
love
can,
all those examples. Like had Bill Gates been born maybe 5 years earlier or 5 years later, he would not have been there at that moment when
yeah,
that
yeah.
his particular talent came online at the moment it was needed.
Yeah, well, there's certainly something to be said about that. And I think that people tend to enjoy what they're good at as well. There's that factor. And they need opportunities, they need encouragement. But there are people who, despite lack of encouragement, will find opportunities and will pursue things regardless. So they're very
Hmm.
strong people.
Hmm. Yeah, there maybe there's an argument for G, general intelligence, along with general physical health and ability and so on. All that adds up in any environment you're going to be in. But there's so much luck. Again, even in twins, I could just imagine, one neuron zigs and the other one zags in the other twin or something, and you just have this slightly different neural processes and
Yeah, that can
no way to
happen.
predict that.
Yeah, luck can play a part, but then I wonder about luck. You know, we are in certain environments more than others. Now, weird things can happen in certain environments, but you're in that environment because you chose to be, probably, not that you were
Hmm.
plucked there. So there's kind of a fine line between how you actually define luck, I think.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. So, I migrate toward certain sports or activities that I like. It's not, I didn't meet these people totally randomly because they're doing the thing I like to do, something
That,
like that.
that's exactly what I mean. Exactly what I mean. Yeah. Yeah.
You're the world's leading expert on twins now. You must get some interesting letters and phone
Oh,
calls and
Michael, you don't know how many, but I'm very fortunate because that's how I learn things and that's how I get opportunities and that's why I run around the world the way that I do. It's so much fun. What I love about twin studies is that they're so informative, but they're also a lot of fun. And I'm lucky that I found my niche. I mean, I found it very early as a senior in college. I fell in love with twin studies and it's been that way ever since. It's been an ongoing love affair.
so what do you guys do at your lab there at Cal State Fullerton? Do you have grad students that help
Yeah,
you and
we
all
have
that?
grad students, undergrads, we process data, we run twins, we have a lot of projects going on. We're doing studies on decision making, we're doing studies on bereavement, on twin family relations, many, many, many things.
Oh, somebody asked me to ask you about, like this twin ESP.
Oh, God, that's a tired question. You know,
I know.
there is no such thing that I can see twin ESP. What it is that identical twins have similar information processing strategies, perceive the world the same way, come to similar decisions about things. And so I think they give ESP like events. And when they come up with the same answers on tests, then it's not that they're communicating, but they respond to problems the same way. I've actually been an expert witness in many cases involving twins cheating because they think that they're sharing information when in fact they're just being themselves. In fact, the Beds are twins. The Beds are twins. They were famous cricket players in England a while back. And when they were children, they came up with exactly the same test scores. The teacher said, "This is impossible. We'll separate them." Same thing happened.
That's really funny. Legal cases. So you sometimes consult as an expert witness?
Yeah, legal cases on wrongful death, on injury, custody, even immigration, and cheating. I've had a number of cheating cases. In fact, one absolutely went viral last November, 2022. Two identical twins were accused of cheating on a second year medical school examination because they came up with very similar answers. The proctor said it was too similar. This is the amazing part, Michael. So they gave the test performance to a company called Cavion, and Cavion compared their responses to those of randomly generated pairs and said these twins obviously cheated. Well, of course their responses will be more alike. They're identical twins. If they hadn't been more alike, I would have been surprised. So anyway, I brought in all this evidence, and what was so great about that case was the jury is not given an amount to suggest as an award. They came up with $1.5 million for these twins.
What? Really?
Yep.
Wow.
I'm surprised you missed the case. It was all over the place.
Yeah, I missed that one.
Yeah, South
Wow.
Carolina. South Carolina Medical School.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was absolutely amazing.
Well, now they'll have to sue ChatGPT for cheating accusations or
That's the next thing. I guess I'll have to be an expert witness for them. I'm
that's
going to
really
write my
funny.
own testimony, though.
All right, Nancy, that's a good place to end. I always love your work and your books, and talking to you about all these things are so interesting. What's next on your research plate?
Next is I'm studying biracial twins, the so-called biracial twins, fraternal
Oh,
twins born to mixed marriage couples, kids who look
all
like they come
right.
from different populations and have different experiences and what the parenting challenges are. So I'm working on that now. I am developing a new book proposal, and I'm going to be promoting my book on the Holocaust and my book on the gay father's twin sons.
Oh, nice. Very good.
And one more thing I'm doing, I'm on leave this whole year. I'm also a consultant for the third time for the Guinness World Records. They're twin pages, and that's a lot of fun. That's a lot
Oh
of fun.
my God. What are
Yeah.
some of the records that people are
Well, I mean,
posting?
the oldest Mengele twin survivor is one.
I
And
see.
last time I worked for them, I found twins who were born 90 days apart, which was a record.
90 days?
Years
What?
apart. Yeah, one twin was ready, one twin
God.
wasn't. And I find, the oldest twins or the longest. There's another record I'm going to talk about in this next batch where the twins were successfully separated, but they were together the longest. They were together for 4 years before they were separated. That's another record.
Right.
Yeah. So there
Right.
are many, many records out there still to be discovered, and I can hardly wait.
Is there enough data to tease apart differences in how long you were together before separated in identical twins? Like one,
Eh,
like 1 day, 1 year, five
Yeah,
years, whatever.
yeah. There's plenty of data that way. Yeah, plenty of data that way. But then what it actually means is hard to say because every pair is connected in different ways. There can be connected at
Mm.
the pelvis or the head or, you know, the legs. I mean, there's many, many variations of conjoined twinning. So it's hard to
Oh,
make definitive statements. But yeah,
oh no, sorry. I meant twins that are separated, but
oh,
not at some at birth, some at 1 month, some at 1 year, some at 5 years or whatever.
yeah. Well,
Um,
we had data on that from Minnesota, the years that they were reunited. And we found that whether they spent a lot of time together or little didn't matter in terms of
mm,
similarity.
right. Yeah. Again, the power of genes, it's there.
It's there, Michael. Can't deny it.
All right, Nancy, thanks. Thanks for coming on. Nice to
Thanks,
talk to you
Michael.
again.
Thanks a lot.